Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. It is the story that gripped Canada and even the world in 2022. It is the story of the Freedom Convoy. Led by truckers, the convoy quickly became the hottest news story and a worldwide sensation, seemingly overnight. And while it did dominate the headlines, many of us had little knowledge of who was organizing or what was really happening behind the scenes and really how it came to be. Where did it all start, really? Well, joining me now is Andrew Lawton. He's a senior journalist with True North and host of The Andrew Lawton Show. He is the author of this book, Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. This is the first book that has been written. Maybe there will be others, I don't know, but it was the first look that kind of gives readers a glimpse or an opportunity to go behind the scenes and see really what happened. And for me, I really appreciated hearing how it all started, because we only knew about these things when it hit the media, but there were several days before that when kind of things started going. So maybe I'll start with you with that question. What triggered this convoy to start?
I think, the short answer of that is that it was this one really negative incident at the border that this one cross-border trucker, a woman named Bridget Belton from southwestern Ontario, encountered, where she had been going back and forth without issue from Canada to the US and back to Canada and so on. And she is uncomfortable wearing a mask. And there are reasons that the book explains for that. But she was in her truck alone with just her and her dog going through a border crossing. I think it was in Windsor. And she's alone in her truck, and the border guard threatened her with arrest if she didn't put on her mask. And it wasn't just this one incident, but it was really this overarching sense of feeling like no one was in control of their own lives after 2 years of intermittent lockdowns, restrictions, and mandates. And she started connecting with other truckers on TikTok and said, we got to do something about this. And it took a few twists and turns that the book explains, but it ended up with what we now know as the Freedom Convoy.
My goodness. And, I know initially some folks suggested that this was primarily a Western organization, almost even a Western separatist movement in the very early days. But clearly the precursor was, again, a Southwestern Ontario woman. And just to be clear, I did read the book and I was shocked, I guess, to find out that she was berated for not wearing the mask. She suffers from asthma, severe asthma, and she was a victim of domestic violence. So there were, can I say bona fide reasons where she really couldn't wear the mask or really felt uncomfortable wearing one.
Yeah, and not only that, but you then have fast forward a couple of weeks and you have the cross-border trucker mandate, which just added insult to injury, and truckers that have been putting up with what Bridget Belton and others had been enduring for the last 2 years. And the one thing that I found most interesting about Bridget's story is that she was really she was hanging on by a thread. And when the mandate came, that didn't snap the thread. It actually gave her a lot more strength, because it all of a sudden gave her the idea that things have gotten so bad, we have to push back, we have to move forward. And she connected mostly by TikTok, which is interesting, with other truckers, notably Chris Barber, who was from Saskatchewan, who was one of the real faces of the convoy as far as truckers are concerned. And then all these other people got involved, and in many cases very quickly, which was one of the drawbacks that the convoy had as well, is that anyone and everyone who wanted to be a part of this thing could be a part of it.
Well, to me, it seemed, as you mentioned with Brigitte Belton, that there was a desperation in the air, and people had, and I think this is why it garnered so much support. We could talk about this later, but that people were so desperate for something to happen that there seemed to be no end to the increasing, government infringement on the rights or increasing encroachments. So something had to happen, and finally something did. And people were like, wait, we can support that. We're going to get on board.
Yeah, and I think for truckers in particular, one of the reasons they made such good heroes in this story is because everyone had been for the last 2 years talking about them as being the essential workers, the heroes, the backbones of these communities throughout the pandemic. So when the government went after them, all of these people who had heard the government say, including Justin Trudeau, hashtag thank a trucker for the last 2 years, that was really the triggering effect of people saying, well, hang on, I thought these were the heroes. I thought these were the ones that were to give great thanks to for keeping us going through the pandemic. Why are they now the enemies if they're not vaccinated?
And it's true that January 22nd deadline 2022, when there was this reciprocal arrangement where you had to be doubly vaccinated and show proof of vaccination to go across the border, regardless if you were an essential worker, which trucks transporting goods were considered essential. That was a hard and fast line in the sand for many people, especially the truckers, and they just said enough. Welcome back. I'm joined by Andrew Lawton, who's the author of this excellent read, this excellent book, Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. Andrew, again, thanks for joining me again, and congrats on this book. I did really enjoy reading it, and it filled in many, many gaps that I had in my understanding of what was going on behind the scenes with the convoy. So one question that early raised, and of course, it took twists and turns. I think we finally understood the end, but rehash it for our audience. What were the main demands, or what were the things the convoy were asking for, and were they met?
So at the beginning, I think a lot of people jumped on to wanting the end to the cross-border mandate for truckers. And that was certainly, I think, the genesis of this, which gave it such momentum and such wide appeal. But early on, and by early on, I mean before the trucks even got on the highway, they wanted an end to all vaccine mandates and all vaccine passports. So whether it was the provincial vaccine passports to go to a gym or go to a restaurant, or the federal vaccine mandates for air travel, for working in the public sector, or for entering the country without quarantine. They wanted an end to all of those. And as we know, many of these things are still in effect. The mandate for air travel has been suspended, but the government hasn't ruled out bringing it back. The mandate for public servants, very similar. It's been suspended. They may bring it back. A lot of the provincial restrictions, they ended very soon after the convoy started gaining momentum. But they've all said, in most provinces anyway, that if the flu season seems bad in the fall and winter, these restrictions could be coming back. And the cross-border trucker mandate still remains in effect. That still is on the books today. So it would be easy to look at this and say it was a failure as a movement, but I think you have to look at all of the changes that did happen very soon after the convoy started gaining steam. Things like Quebec announcing an end to their misguided attack on the unvaccinated that was coming through fines. Or in Quebec, for a time, you couldn't even go to a big box retailer if you were unvaccinated. Also, vaccine passports in Alberta, Ontario, Saskatchewan, they all got lifted within a few days of each other, or plans to lift them were announced within a few days of each other when the trucks were on the way to Ottawa or just after they had arrived.
You're right. I did notice it was almost a domino effect. And I think you're right. It did start, I think, with Quebec, where they scrapped that ill thought out plan of fining citizens who weren't vaccinated. So provincially, it looked like there was quite a bit of action. Federally, was there any response?
It depends what you mean by response. The federal government, no. They dug their heels in and went to vilification. They wanted nothing to do with this. And a part of me wonders if the cross-border trucker mandate is still in effect just out of spite, just to punish these truckers that showed up and humiliated the government. But I also do think that Aaron O'Toole's ousting is a very significant chapter in this, because Aaron O'Toole came out, and this was a situation, especially early on, where virtually every single conservative Canadian was supportive of the truckers, and even a heck of a lot of non-conservative Canadians. So when Aaron O'Toole got up there and couldn't answer in a press conference the question of yes or no, do you support the truckers, it was humiliating. And it was only in a few days that the caucus members had gotten together, signed the letter, had a vote, and Aaron O'Toole was gone. Now, you know full well there were a lot of other issues that have been brewing since long before the convoy, but the convoy claimed it as a victory. MPs that I've spoken to have said that it certainly triggered a why now discussion for those who wanted to get rid of Aaron O'Toole. And as a result, they had a leader come in who was prepared to take a stand on the vaccine mandate issue and on the vaccine passport issue. So even if the government wasn't giving them action on it, I think it was significant that there was a political party that was prepared to represent those people, which there wasn't before the convoy started.
And it's true. And there was almost a chill in the caucus. And that could be the topic of a whole nother show, where and in the opposition caucus, where nobody seemed to be willing to speak out on these issues. Maybe they were going to get reprimanded by their leader at that time, O'Toole, who knows. But now that there's been this change, now there's an interim leader, there's a leadership run, and who knows, the victor of this leadership for the CPC, the Conservative Party of Canada leadership, could very well become the next prime minister. So, we may be seeing the fruits, both positive and negative, from the convoy for years to come.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me to see the leadership race really become, in a lot of ways, a contest among the candidates on who supported the convoy first, who supported it better. There's Jean Charest, who's taken a very anti-convoy position, but Pierre Poilievre, Leslyn Lewis, Roman Baber, to some extent Scott Aitchison, all of them are generally speaking supportive of the convoy and supportive of its aims. And that in and of itself, I think, is a significant shift within the Conservative Party, which, if you look back to the last election, is a big part of why the PPC did so well. They were the only political entity talking about this issue.
Okay, we're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. I'm having a great discussion with Andrew Lawton, who's the author of this book called Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. Welcome back, Andrew. We heard now how the convoy started in this, tiny but still significant incident from one trucker's experience at the border crossing. But quickly it ballooned, and there seemed to be a plethora of persons either representing or organizing for the convoy. One name stuck out and still continues to stand out is Tamara Lich. How did Tamara Lich get involved, and is she the de facto leader of the convoy?
I mean, the idea of leader and organizer, and there's a whole chapter devoted to this to some extent, is a really complicated one because the media used organizer as a derisive term. Anyone they didn't like was a convoy organizer. To the people on the ground, they were led by no one. They were there because they showed up as a sign of support, and they weren't being told to be there. In many cases, they weren't given any money or even compensation. And Tamara Lich was certainly involved very early on. So this core group that had Chris Barber and Bridget Belton in it, they were talking, and Tamara Lich came on pretty early on and said, hey, you guys, I'm going to start a social media page for you and a GoFundMe, and did that. And they were all very, very welcoming of her because she was offering to do this thing that they weren't doing, because originally it was all word of mouth and TikTok videos and stuff like that. And the interesting thing is Tamara didn't know how big this was going to get. She said that she expected it would raise like $20,000 to buy some truckers some sandwiches. And it was Chris Barber that told her, I think it was to set it at $250,000 for the fundraising target. And she said, you're crazy. I'm doing 100, but even that's too much. And they met that. I think it was in a little over 24 hours. And within a week, they were at $1 million. And then it got to the point where they could raise $1 million a day. So it was very much defined by that grassroots momentum, which was far greater than anything that any one person, Tamara Lich or otherwise, could do at the so-called helm.
It was disorganized grassroots activism. I mean, is there anything really better? Really, Canadians speaking up, and I appreciate that. Look, whether I agree with an issue or don't agree with an issue, I love people exercising their democratic right to use their voice and speak out on things, especially things that really disturb them, and this was clearly the case. You mentioned the GoFundMe, and so much of the media attention and the drama surrounding the convoy seemed to be focused around the financing of it. And there are many questions Canadians still have. So initially, there was a partnership, if you will, or the convoy used the platform, as you just described, with GoFundMe. But then quickly that money was ordered out, and there was over $1 to $2 million raised. Did any of that money ever go anywhere? What happened to that money?
So I'll try to give the quickest answer I can to what is a very convoluted question. So GoFundMe raised $1 million. That's what $10 million effectively. And of that, they only released 1 million, which very quickly was frozen by TD Bank because they were going through all of the suspicion on their end about where the money was from. And we know that government was lobbying as well. And then at a certain point, the Ontario government put a court order in effect. They got a court order that made it illegal to touch the money, basically, to use it. And then GoFundMe had canceled the campaign altogether. and eventually refunded it. So most of the GoFundMe money was refunded. The little bit that had been released by them was frozen. So then they pivoted to Give Send Go, which is an American company. And through that, they raised even more than they had with GoFundMe in a fraction of the time. But all of the restrictions that the Canadian government put in place through the Emergencies Act effectively made it impossible to get that money into Canada. So it was ultimately refunded as well. So of the online donations, only about, I think it was $36,000 were ever claimed by the convoy. And that money almost all went into fuel. But the thing was, and this is where I think the media got it wrong and the government got it wrong, money was not the fuel, pardon the pun, of the convoy. It was a symptom. It was an outcome of the grassroots support that we were talking about. Because when the government shut off these channels, people started showing up with cash, like thousands of dollars of cash they'd bring to Ottawa. They would shove it in truckers' hands. They had baskets out that people were putting hundreds, thousands of dollars into. And no one that I talked to was ever hungry. No one was ever short on fuel. They all had this because of people just showing up and providing things that they needed.
Yes, it was, and it was quite the environment or the experience down at the convoy. I've heard from so many firsthand accounts that, that you're right. They came with drawings from their children, food baskets, cash. And the atmosphere at the convoy was one of jubilation, which something, again, in the middle of winter, in the middle of a lockdown, a lot of people seem to have been deprived of that camaraderie. We're going to continue this discussion in just a few moments. Welcome back. I'm with Andrew Lawton, author of the book Freedom Convoy, 3 Weeks That Shook the World. The story of 3 weeks that shook the world, rather. Andrew, the sense on the ground was one of jubilation. We saw the photos, hot tubs, bouncy castles, dancing in the streets. It quickly seemed to turn into this one ginormous festival, not foreign in the capital of Ottawa, where a lot of people gather for festivals or protests. There were also reports that there were some unsavory characters. We heard reports of Confederate flags and neo-Nazi symbols. You were there on the ground quite a bit. Did you see that? Were there unsavory characters involved in making up the convoy?
So, I mean, the short answer is anyone could have been there. We're talking about thousands of people, no vetting, no application process. Anyone could have showed up, savory or unsavory. But I will talk about those specific incidents you've mentioned there because they dominated media coverage, especially that first weekend. The Confederate flag, a Nazi flag. The Confederate flag, if you watch the video, which didn't go as viral as the photo, you see the crowd of protesters actually heckling this guy who had his full face covered and chasing him out of the crowd. So I think it's almost certain that he was an instigator. And if not, the crowd wanted nothing to do with him. So I'd say mission accomplished. The guy with the swastika flag, my colleague Candace Malcolm put up a bounty trying to identify him and still has never been able to. So I don't know if this is someone who is an actual Nazi or if it's someone that was trying to undermine the convoy movement or if it was someone who was trying to make a ham-fisted attack on the government by calling them Nazis. Like no one knows. But the whole point is that these things did not represent the convoy as a whole. And these things were very quickly and swiftly denounced, not just by the leaders of the convoy, but by the people there on the ground who saw this.
Right. I appreciate that. So on that vein, you were there reporting, and I read many of your reports, and you did an excellent job. There were other independent media. There was a lot of network broadcast mainstream media there. Some Canadians, and I've seen many reports, and they still to this day are bitter or were disturbed at. They criticize the media coverage of the convoy, saying that it was too biased. Are these criticisms fair? Do you feel that the convoy got a good shake by the mainstream media?
I think absolutely the criticisms are fair, and that's not an indictment of every single reporter. There were some that were out there quite regularly talking to people, getting a sense of who they were and why they were there and what they were protesting. But there were also a lot of unhinged reports. I mean, there was the one clip that went viral of a CBC reporter without evidence wondering if Russian actors were behind this whole thing, just throwing it out there, just seeing. And you had other media that were really stoking the insurrection narrative, the January 6th narrative, the idea that this was going to be violent when there wasn't a whiff of that, when they were seeing bouncy castles and pig roasts and all of this. So I think that this only inflamed the anti-media bent that we were seeing from people in the convoy. And to be fair, I mean, I called out the heckling that a lot of people were doing of journalists that were out there in the crowd, because, I mean, just as a matter of practicality, when you heckle a reporter, that's the footage they have of you shouting whatever at them. So it only furthers that misrepresentation of it. So yeah, there were individually good reporters, but I think by and large, the media coverage really didn't capture what this thing was about.
And finally, in the final act that seemed to be of the convoy, or treatment of the convoy, was the Emergency Act that was passed, or that was implemented. And quickly we saw our streets in Ottawa turn into, it looked like a police state, and you were right there in the thick of it. Share with us what happened that day, and where do we go from there?
Yeah, I mean, I was pepper sprayed, so I believe that's the definition of taking one for the team when you're out there in the field. And I wasn't protesting, I was covering. And there was a photographer from New York who was slammed to the ground and zip tied. There was another reporter who had a tear gas canister shot at her leg. So these were not uncommon things. And after the convoy had been disbanded, police were threatening with arrest anyone that was walking down the street without what they deemed was a valid purpose. And I was threatened with arrest, but at other points I was able to walk around. So it was inconsistent. But I think what happened here is when the Emergencies Act was invoked, the lie that came along with it was that charter rights are intact. Your right to peacefully protest remains. And what we saw on the ground is that was not the case at all. It may be years before the lawsuits are settled on all of this, but I can tell you the right to protest, the right to freedom of the press were not intact on the ground.
Okay, and now, unfortunately, we've run out of time. If people want to purchase your book, where can they go to get it?
The Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world, is available on Amazon and also from the publisher direct at sutherlandhousebooks.com and hopefully at your neighborhood bookstore.
Okay, Andrew, thank you so much for joining and sharing these details on the convoy. A fascinating read, truly.
Thank you so much.